I'm Paul Taylor, author of the most complete political machine ever known, the Union Leagues in the Civil War, and you're watching Author's Voice.
Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and our show is A House Divided. And as usual, we're in the broadcast studio embedded in Abraham Lincoln Bookshop here in Chicago. If you're watching on Facebook Live, please use the comments button to ask a question just below and ask a question, but give us your name and where you're from so we can give a shout out and say hello. You can also order a signed first edition book at any time during the show. So please feel free to do that, and we'll get it signed and get it right out to you by the mails. If you're watching on YouTube after the broadcast, you can't ask a question, but you can still order a signed book so while supplies last. So please do that. We most likely will have what you need. Well, today we're going to have a redux of Paul Taylor, who has been with us before, and I'm happy to invite him back in. He's a retired insurance professional, author of 6 previous books on the Civil War, including Glory Was Not Their Companion, the 26th New York Volunteer Infantry. He hath loosed the fateful lightning, the Battle of Ox Hill, Chantilly, and also Orlando M. Poe, Civil War general and Great Lakes engineer that you were here last for. That was a great little book. But today's book, his latest, the most complete political machine ever known, and the Norse Union Leagues in the American Civil War. Kent State University Press is 322 pages and illustrated, and is $45. More reasonable than the Poe book was, by the way, when that came out. And it's worth every penny of that, by the way, because this is a book that has not been done before. You're going to find things in here, as you'll see today, that are really fascinating and enlightening. So where to begin? I think I'm going to begin by asking you about patriotism, since that is really in your book. I want to show a piece that I had years ago. This is just a Xerox of it, called The Committee for a Day's Labor. And why I'm showing this is because patriotism went down through the entire society. Just like in World War II, the San Quentin prisoners, they were making uniforms for World War II in the Pacific for the sailors. And these women did a committee for a day's labor, which was a central fair for the Sanitary Commission in Philadelphia in 1864. And they say that they're always ready to a fellow feelings of humanity, agree to open their respective places of amusement on the days mentioned for the benefit of the sanitary fair. And of course, who are these women? The prostitutes. But they felt patriotic. They had to support the Union cause, and they were asking people to come in, and for the safety of the ladies engaged in this Christian duty to humanity, none of the visitors will be allowed to come to tea without French kid gloves, which for convenience can be had at the door. But that shows everyone was involved in the war in a patriotic duty. So it's the heart of the book, as you say, and of course patriotism seems to be maybe everywhere, but certainly in the DNA of Americans. But of course, as Mel Brooks said, the 2,000-year-old man, going back to the cave days, he gave his anthem of the cave, and he said, "Let them all go to hell except Cave 7." So is that the essence of patriotism?
Well, the core element of patriotism is virtue. And the Union League put forth the idea that in the time of a civil war in which the country's survival was at stake, there was really no differentiating between the government and the administration. And that if you're going to have virtue and love of country, you have to support both, because otherwise the country will fail.
Well, so is virtue the definition of patriotism?
Well, that's its core element. Patriotism is a love of country, unencumbered by issues that might cause it to fail in times of strife. One of the quotes that I use in the book, famous 18th century Irish diplomat said, when bad men combine, the good men must come together. Otherwise, they will fail one by one.
Well, if patriotism is one side, the other side has to be treason. And that's also been at the heart of this book. And certainly free speech was. You talk very briefly, you mentioned the Lincoln Catechism. I have a copy of it here, actually, an original. And I just love this. And it's the first book to have Lincolniana in it, by the way. But it must have been tough to be a peace Democrat and not be able to use free speech. So did free speech go out the door? Was it just a sanctioned cloak for treason?
Well, free speech was certainly allowable, that First Amendment right. But what the Union Leagues put forth was that if you did not support the government as they define that you should, there would be a social price to pay. You had to support the government, and you had the right to free speech, but if we didn't like what you said, you would pay the price.
Ostracism is one, for instance?
Social ostracism, commercial ostracism, it existed within the church as well.
Did this happen in the South also?
Oh, absolutely. The South's codes of manly honor existed in the same way, that if you did not support the Confederate cause, you were what became known as a scalawag in the post-Civil War years during Reconstruction. So it existed across the board.
Let's get to the antecedents, because there were other areas before, other leagues, other whatever before, secret fraternal organizations, because the Union League started out very secretly too, if I remember from your book. But there was an unrelated Union League in New York City. The Knights of the Golden Circle were there. The Masons, Know Nothings, even Wide Awakes. I think we have a Wide Awake banner to show. The union clubs in the border states. So what were the antecedents to the leagues that they may have gotten their ideas from?
Well, the secretive fraternal organizations were very popular to the 19th century male. One scholar put forth that they provided a means of passage into adulthood while advancing up through the ranks, and you will. Prior to the Civil War, especially in the 4 border states, a lot of these antecedents, union clubs, came together as a means of protection. In some areas, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, loyalty to the Union was tenuous. Unlike in, say, the far north or the deep south, you often didn't really know the political persuasions of your neighbors. So these union clubs, secretive in nature so that its members might be known to each other, provided a means of camaraderie and safety. They also performed home guard duty to protect each other. The Wide Awakes you mentioned were probably the best known. They started in Hartford, Connecticut, by the way, had a very steely martial appearance, and they were probably most similar to what the Union Leagues would become in the summer of 1862.
But the Union Leagues didn't start out with having large parades or anything like that. That was more the Wide Awake thing.
Yes.
They were more secretive in that regard.
Yes.
It's interesting because you really start out in the summer of '62 and go into '63 is the heart of the book. And that was the inflection point when the civilians were feeling this most, I think. Now, I happen to have right now, that's one thing we can have here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. We can have different artifacts from the war. And here's one that came out of Peoria, Illinois, and it's talking about the Copperheads that were there. And a Good Samaritan Society that was the Copperheads' way of trying to get their ideas out, at least in this area. I know there were many local clubs as well. So here they are saying that, that the leaders are bitter Copperheads who openly avowed that they would never give $1 for the Union during the war. The loyal men and women of Peoria desire you to know the facts, belying that when you do know them, you will spurn their hypocritical embraces with scorn. So is this the sort of thing that was coming out across the nation when they saw the Copperhead movement and others of running dogs with them?
Absolutely. The Copperheads, which was a nickname given to that faction of the Democratic Party that was virulently anti-Lincoln, anti-war, anti-black. They simply believed the war was not worth it in the cost of men, material, blood, and treasure. And as 1862, the summer went past, repeated military losses, the economic cost of the war was beginning to hit home, escalating casualties. You started to see more and more overt street demonstrations, started to get some riots in Wisconsin in the latter part of 1862. This faction, which had kind of kept quiet at the beginning, there was kind of a camaraderie, one for all, no party now in 1861. A lot of that had vanished by 1862. And your pro-Lincoln men, pro-Union men, felt that they had to respond in kind.
Well, you started to say before, here's a quote that I have from the book. The truth will be an organization dedicated to local protections and national loyalty. It came from the citizens upward, is what you were saying in the book. And so what was the impetus, and that was the impetus, and how did that grow? And why especially the three cities you mentioned most here, of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, and why in those cities in particular did they grow?
New York and Philadelphia in particular began in late 1862 because the leading wealthy men of both of those towns began to sense that the war was not going well, and they wanted to create an organization where treason would not be uttered, and as a means of putting forth a pro-Lincoln, pro-Union viewpoint, as a means of countering what they saw as the treasonous pronouncements of the Copperheads, as well as a means of countering the subversive violence that they were starting to see. While the three big aristocratic, is the way I use it, private clubs in those three cities were created in late 1862, early 1863, the actual Union League movement began in Illinois in the summer of 1862. The three states, especially the southern counties of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, were hotbeds of Copperhead discontent. From a geographic perspective, those three parts of the country actually dipped down farther south than much of Virginia.
As we like to say here, Cairo, Illinois, the tip of Illinois is further south than Richmond.
Yes.
And really Lincoln grew up in a border state in mid-central Illinois.
Yes. Yeah, that was...
So was it local, or did people like Governor Yates of Illinois, the first governor in the Civil War, and Joseph Medill, the editor here in Chicago for the Chicago Tribune, Were they part of this? Was it as elite out here as it was out in the East?
Well, they were extremely supportive of the Union League movement as small town councils began to be created throughout Illinois, in Ohio, and Indiana. Joseph Medill was a staunch supporter of the Union League movement, and through his paper urged people in small towns to start forming Union League councils. Yates was a supporter of the Union League movement. But most of your Union League councils in the Midwestern states were small town in nature, very organic, grassroots, bottom up. The three probably best known Union League clubs were formed, created, and run by the wealthy patrician elite in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. They were very supportive of the other ones, but maintained their autonomy.
Did most of them maintain autonomy? There was no national Union League?
No. As the Union League movement grew throughout the early part of 1863, all of these now hundreds of councils throughout the Midwest and even up and down the eastern seaboard began to realize that there needed to be some kind of national coordination. So in May of 1863, there was a two-day convention in Cleveland, Ohio, at which the national umbrella group called the Union League of America was created with its national headquarters in Washington, D.C. And from that point, with the coordination created, it just really started to take off.
What it just came to me is the Sanitary Commission was also national. Did they coalesce? Were some of the same people on the Sanitary Commission as the Union League national
Absolutely.
organization?
The Sanitary Commission, while a national organization, had its leadership headquartered in New York City. And a number of the men who sat on the board of the Sanitary Commission became co-founders of the Union League Club of New York, including George Templeton Strong, who was mentioned predominantly in the book, very prominent attorney, Oliver Gibbs, who was a noted chemist of the era, Frederick Olmsted, who world-famous architect. They said that the Union League was the child of the Sanitary Commission.
Mm-hmm. Well, by the way, George Templeton Strong's diary, 4 volumes, when it was printed up in the mid-20th century and is available, I'm not sure if it's still in print or not, is a fabulous diary. If you ever want to really read through the war, the Mary Boykin Chestnut, perhaps, of the North, George Templeton Strong, I think, is what I would recommend for that.
Absolutely.
Now, there were differences between these 3 cities' Union Leagues. For instance, Philadelphia admitted war Democrats, but New York did not. Why those differences?
I don't think it was intentional. The Union League movement, and I think this is a very important point, is that while in the final year of the war, the Union League movement was an open arm of the Republican Party, initially in early 1863, it flew a nonpartisan banner. You could be a Democrat and a member of the Union League as long as you were offered unconditional loyalty to the Lincoln administration and all of its policies to suppress the rebellion. Most of the initial members of the Philadelphia League were Democrats, in fact, per their articles of association. In the case of New York, I don't think it was anything intentional. I think in New York, many Democrats could not see themselves joining an organization of that nature.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's take, this was not, the North wasn't Kansas. You weren't going to wake up one day with your neighbor with a blunderbuss in your face. Right. But how widespread in the North were Copperheads and people who thought similarly to them, or maybe peace Democrats to Copperheads, what percent of the populace were they that spurred up the Union Leagues to do something about them?
Well, the Copperheads were a significant faction of the Democratic Party. And again, when we say Copperheads, we're talking about a person who was resolutely anti-Lincoln and against the war. They just didn't, the war wasn't worth it. Let the South go, and it certainly, most white Americans of that era were virulent racists based on our definition today. They certainly didn't believe that the war was worth it in the sense of risking white lives and livelihoods to free black slaves.
I'm going to interrupt, because if they were going to let the South go, what then about the nationalization into territories? They would have been their own country and had no way to get into the territories, which would still be under federal control, I suppose. Is that what they would have thought?
Well, I don't know if it got that deep, into the book. They just didn't. They didn't like the idea of the war being fought. That, bear in mind, slavery was legal in much of the country. They believed that the slavery issue should be handled at the ballot box and not at the cannon's mouth.
Let's talk about the differences in geographic differences of the Union League. They probably had different perceived threats in the East than perhaps they did in the West, or actually in the border states as well. So how about the East? What were they like? And what were the differences between the East, the Midwest, the border states, and those threats I'm talking about?
Well, when we think of the East, we think of the three big, well-known leagues that were New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. And there we were thinking rich wood-paneled buildings, brandy snifters, leather chairs. These very wealthy men were engaged in recruiting both white and what were known as colored regiments, offering advice and money to the government. In the Midwest, however, the states that I mentioned of Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, somewhat in Wisconsin, you had a much more working man, middle-class membership who often feared for their personal safety. Many of the Union League councils in the small towns in the Midwest and even the far west, say California, formed home guard companies. These men, they had seen the riots in Wisconsin, in Detroit, heard about the riot, the anti-draft riot in New York. Some of them had seen their farms burned, their barns burned with all livestock inside, their fruit trees vandalized, threats made against their neighbors. They knew that the overt subversive insurrection in some areas by Copperheads was real. And so in some cases, they took up the musket to protect themselves. It was not just, the Union Leagues were not merely a patriotic, chest-thumping society. They set the definition through their publication societies and pamphlets as to what was proper loyalty in the Civil War era North.
Let's talk very briefly about the West. I happen to have a strange broadside here that is a proclamation after Lincoln's death, where they're mourning the chief magistrate's death. And of course, Nevada came in because the Republicans needed more electoral votes, and they knew Nevada would help supply those. So just before the 1864 election, Nevada came in. So that's kind of that's just an entree to What was the West like? How much did they feel the threat from Copperheads and other anti-war? They were far from the action.
Well, in California, for example, the Union generals in charge of what was known as the Army of the Pacific for the Union feared the Copperhead threat immensely. They had reports and worries that the Copperhead threat numbered into the tens of thousands. So Union leagues were formed in California, and with a complete nod and a wink, these Union military men viewed the Union leagues as a form of civilian paramilitary force, which obviously caused great concern to Democrats that you now had an armed, sanctioned civilian force working hand in glove with the government.
Is this Fox News armed? Just wondering.
Yeah.
Sounds it. There were secret initiations into these, is that right?
Yes.
And does that continue on, or does that abate later on?
It continued all through the war and even somewhat into the South during Reconstruction. But a member's initiation into a Union League council was likened to a solemn religious ceremony that featured prayers, oaths, songs, a flag-draped altar. It was very serious. You couldn't just join. You had to know someone who was a member. If they thought you were a good fit, that you displayed proper loyalty towards the Union, that existing member would recommend your name, and then it would be voted on. If you were denied, you were not told why, but that if, in some instances, when you might be able to reapply. Some councils were more secretive than others. Some felt that it was good that the community should know who the members were, others less so. But what was discussed within the four walls, so to speak, was usually, as one league member put it, kind of like a family. It just stays within the family.
Let's take an overall view here for a moment, because I put them down the evolution of the Union leagues over time. Because the sentiments seemed to change. It began as a refuge for liberty, then drawing a line between liberty and treason, then neutrality being a crime. You could not be neutral in this. You're for us or against us. War's end does not end the fight. It went on. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. So is that the evolution that took place? And were they also tied, this evolution, tied to successes or defeats on the battlefield?
Well, the initial, the defeats on the battlefield in 1862 had a great impetus on the League's creation. Again, initially it was a nonpartisan movement. The Republicans' serious losses in the November 1862 congressional races had an impetus as well, that something had to be done. So throughout all of 1863, you see councils forming all across the country. And in addition to these councils forming chapters, if you will, in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, these leagues also created their quasi-affiliated publication societies, who began producing vast quantities of pamphlets and broadsides for distribution throughout the land, in which they're starting to set the bar for what is proper loyalty and versus what is treason. treason is the only crime defined in the Constitution. And one of its key elements is that what is defined as treason also includes the words giving aid and comfort to the enemy. So, since the South had ready access to Northern newspapers, the Union League believed that if you were publishing anti-Union, anti-Lincoln, pro-Southern editorials or sermons or speeches in Northern papers, well, surely this is giving aid and comfort to the rebel enemy, that they're seeing there's such discontent in the North, and therefore such words were equated to treason.
We're hearing some of this today. You mentioned when you first came in that you see some parallels to today as well because of how treason is defined.
Absolutely. So these the enemies of the Union Leagues, again, they had the legal right to say these things per their First Amendment. But the leagues then made sure that there would be this social price to pay. I make a point in there that the ostracism is not unlike the Facebook unfriending that we sometimes see today. That a lot of the contention that we see in our current political landscape is nothing new.
I saw that.
It existed well back then.
Number of interesting anecdotes that are
Yes.
in here just about that. The Union Leagues became a pretty well-oiled organization.
Absolutely.
And that and part of that really was the pamphleteering, just as in the Revolution. That is what really bound the colonies together, is that pamphlets could be taken, printed, distributed fairly easily and quickly. And so that's what was happening here too. It shaped public opinion, the same in the Revolution, and helped form the Union and helped preserve it, all these pamphlets. So tell us, you say in the book there's an estimate 10 million pamphlets. Someone had said up to 10 million pamphlets perhaps. I know the voters in 1864 were only 4 million, so that's a lot of pamphlets per vote, but it must have inundated everyone. Of course, that's what they did. They could not watch TV, you couldn't tweet, so you had to see a newspaper or a pamphlet, and that's what they did. So who were the writers? Who paid for them? How were they distributed? How did Montgomery Blair's Postal Service help that? And how did the Provost Marshal's office help this? Give us a rounding of this.
The Union League of Philadelphia had its own internal board of publication that was constantly hiring writers to prepare new pamphlets that were either, again, pro-Lincoln, pro-war, anti-South, that were mailed across the country. The New York Union League had their Loyal Publication Society that was doing much of the same thing. And again, there was no formal connection between the club and the Publication Society, but the cross membership was apparent. In Boston, we had the New England Loyal Publication Society that did something very unique. Instead of pamphlets, they prepared reprints, inexpensive reprints of broadsides that they then mailed to hundreds of pro-Lincoln newspapers all across the country. And many times these editors were constantly looking for material to put on their front page. So they welcomed these broadsides.
So the newspapers used the broadsides and the pamphlets.
In many cases. Right.
Just like newspapers use AP or actually listen to television, then the next day they put it in.
Absolutely. So the result of that was that the New England Loyal Publication Society, which was essentially an offshoot of the Union Club of Boston, became the unseen co-editor of scores of newspapers across the country. These three clubs were comprised of the wealthiest men in those cities, so extremely deep pockets. They, through 1863 and especially the 1864 presidential election, they really just blanketed the country and overwhelmed, in my opinion, their Democratic adversaries with material. Now, in the case of the military, Montgomery Blair's post office controlled all of these mails. And then in concert with Union officers in camps, it was remarkable how often Democratic literature would get lost in the mail. In many instances, if Democratic literature reached the Union Army camps, in one case that I mentioned, it was returned to sender totally unopened. So a lot of in-concert machinations going on.
We have a couple of questions from outside our borders, from the web. How were the Union League activities funded? Was there a George Soros or a Koch brother of the time? This is from Mike in Arlington Heights. Thanks, Mike, very much for that question.
Well, as I just mentioned, in the case of the Philadelphia, New York, and Boston leagues, they were comprised of the wealthiest men in the town, some of the wealthiest men in the country. As but one example to illustrate that influence, in late 1863, the Union League Club of New York appealed to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that they wanted to raise, furnish, and outfit what was then known as a colored regiment. And Stanton was initially very much against it. So the Union League gently reminded Stanton that their club was comprised of 500 of the wealthiest men in the country who had been responsible for raising an inordinate amount of money for the Union war effort, and that it might not be a good idea to say no in this situation. Stanton saw the light and relented.
We thank you, Mike, for that. And anyone else who have questions, please feel free. I have a lot of them, and I'll try to get yours in before mine if I can. Here's one from Maurice in Louisville, and we talked about the Knights of the Golden Circle before. Aside from the Copperheads, Maurice asked, what actions, if any, did the Union League take against the Knights of the Golden Circle and the Sons of Liberty?
Well, if you were a member of either of those organizations, then you were almost by definition a Copperhead as well. Much of what they did was the literature, disseminating that. I use the word propaganda in the book, though it's important to note that though the word propaganda today has certain negative connotations, the more classical definition is simply the shaping of public opinion. So they took a lot of effort to discredit these organizations. And then, of course, when the Sons of Liberty conspiracy was exposed by the Union military, I believe in August or September of '64, the Union League pounced all over that, blanketing, again, key states with literature, pamphlets, newspaper articles, as to just what a win for the Democrats would mean with organizations like this.
How about the Commander-in-Chief? How about President Lincoln? What was his relationship with the Union Leagues? Was he a cheerleader? Was he a little more dragged along because it helped him?
Well, I believe Lincoln knew all about the Union Leagues. One of his personal secretaries, William Stoddard, was the Grand National Secretary of the Washington headquarters, a man by the name of James Edmonds, who was the commissioner of the General Land Office and a personal friend of Lincoln's, was the president of the Union League of America. Edmonds was also close personal friends with the very powerful Michigan Senator, Zachariah Chandler, and was close friends with Salmon P. Chase as well. So, between Edmonds and Stoddard, Lincoln certainly knew of any decision that the Union Leagues took or declined to take, and I believe certainly had his tacit approval.
Let's go to another aspect of the Union Leagues, because women became involved. We show in your book Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they certainly had a great impact on the Women's National Loyal League. Did it operate like the Men's League? How did they come into the fray?
Well, by the spring of 1863, many middle, upper class women were starting to notice what their sons, brothers, husbands, fathers had created within the burgeoning Union Leagues, and they wanted to take part as well. Initially, like probably most political activities of the era, the Union Leagues were created as a male-only domain. So what was created were known as ladies' Union Leagues. And these women continued the war effort, the home front war effort, in ways that men could not. Two of the more common things that they did was in their hometowns. They would make sure that merchants were properly patriotic and properly loyal. Those who were deemed not were often boycotted. There are instances of Union League women doling out blows, fisticuffs to copperhead women on the streets. So they...
Umbrella.
Yes. So the ladies' Union Leagues were, I believe, more in the Midwest. In the East, you had the Women's National Loyal League, which was created by Cady and Stanton. I believe it was one of the first, if not the first, women created and driven political associations. And though their name touted how best to help the war effort, much of what they did behind the scenes was more abolition-oriented and women's rights-oriented, though they did have certainly plenty of efforts to promote the war effort to the extent that it would enhance those other two goals.
Did the male Union Leagues support and help, maybe finance, the National Women's Leagues?
Somewhat, to a degree. Often you had situations where men were members of the one and the wife was a member of the other. Men who did not particularly like secret societies and were maybe against the Union Leagues discouraged their wives or daughters from joining those things. But generally, if a man was a member of the Union League, he certainly supported the ladies' Union Leagues within the parameters that social customs of the era allowed.
I don't know why I'm thinking about this, but I'm thinking of the Civil War Roundtable here in Chicago. Began in our shop. And the roundtable, the started in the other room. And it was an all-male society, club, as they all were around the nation, most of them. After time, women were allowed. But here, it was male for many years, and we had a female component because the wives would bring their husbands to the Civil War Roundtable, and then they would have their own organization called the Camp Followers. And I spoke to them. Many others of us from the roundtables came and spoke to them as well. And now, of course, it's one and the same, thankfully. and the world didn't open up and swallow us all, and we still have very fine meetings. The campaign for in 1864 did change how and the Union Leagues, I think, were in the forefront of this, changing from Republican Party to the Union ticket. And I think we have something to show on that, how that happened. The first ticket, the Republicans with Hannibal Hamlin in 1864, it was Union ticket. You didn't see Republican very much. They were trying to gather in everyone under that flag. What was the impetus from that? Was the Union Leagues pushing that as well?
Well, I believe that decision for the Republican Party to now call themselves the Union Party was probably made early in 1864. And a big reason for that decision was that, well, if we're the Union Party, then the Democrats must be the disunion party. So it was a very clever marketing ploy on the part of the Republicans. At the Republican Convention in June of 1864, known as the Union Convention, yes, the words Republican were nowhere to be found. Behind the scenes, everyone knew that, of course, these are the Republicans. By that time, the Union League movement was pretty much an open arm of the Republican Party. They believed that those good, loyal Democrats were already on board. So anybody who wasn't already on board was out in the cold. The Union Leagues, of course, continued to definitely step up and recruit members throughout all of the small towns in the East and the Midwest, because they realized at this point that there was no difference between Union League membership and a Republican vote.
We've talked about the elites, the aristocrats that started the Union League movements, and we've spoken about the women, how they entered the entire fray. What about the working classes, those that didn't go to the Philadelphia, Boston, New York wonderful clubs? They started their own. Did Francis Lieber help with that? Of course, he was promoting the No Party Now movement. And does that really mean our party, Republicans, and not yours, Democrats?
No more Democratic Party is what it really meant.
That's what it really meant. So tell us of the loyal leagues and how now those were more the proletariat, am I correct?
Absolutely. So when the Union League Club of New York, again, 500 men, the creme de la creme, if you will, of business, banking, political class in that city, as that club was coming together in the early part of '63, several members felt that there should be a more broad-based loyalty organization for the working classes. And in spring of 1863, there were actually two clubs created. The Loyal League of Union Citizens, which was created by both a prominent Democrat and prominent Republicans, and then the Loyal National League, which was more in line with the beliefs of the radical Republicans. But they had a dues structure that was very favorable to working men, and it was a way for, working men to join and profess their loyalty to the Union cause as well. Those chapters soon spread throughout New York State and the Mid-Atlantic region, and they are definitely part of the broader Union League movement permeating the country.
Did they also print pamphlets and get those out as well?
They did. Much of that was overseen by those publication societies. The Union League of Philadelphia had its own proletarian offshoot as well that was a formal association for working men. In fact, the two clubhouses, if you will, were literally across the street from each other.
I just want to say, The Most Complete Political Machine is a fascinating book. And we don't, we're all looking at the war and what happens in the politics from Washington and the battles. And we're not really looking at what society was going through and how they were supporting the war effort. This is a terrific book doing that. And I think you will enjoy it. There's still time to purchase this and get it and signed for you. So please feel free to press that button and get it done, and we'll get this right out to you after our discussion here. Let's talk about the Union League's post-war. They certainly have an epigee going into the years 65, 6, 7, going into the South. How did the Union League's role change after that, especially going into the South in Reconstruction and going after the freed blacks? What a fascinating story that is in this, and how the relationship they had with the freedmen and how they were trying to take over, and how the South became, oh my God, this is what we were talking about at the beginning of the war, armed revolution from the slaves. Now they're armed with not only blunderbuss, but the vote.
Yes. When the war ended in the summer of 1865, most of the small town Union League chapters in the Midwest and the West began to close up shop. Their reason for being having ended. The three elite clubs in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston continued on very much as social clubs, and all three of them still exist to this day, by the way. However, the nationalized Union League of America and its internal machinery had no intention of closing up shop. So with the Northern Homefront War won, victory complete, they now turned their eyes southward with the twin goals of racial equality for freedmen, led by the radical Republican contingent, and building a Republican-dominated region over the Democratic South. And their initial goal was targeting the Southern working man, the yeoman farmer, who maybe had not been too happy with the South's rich man's war, poor man's fight conscription policies. Mm-hmm. And that's who they attempted to bring into the fold in an attempt to establish some Republican Party dominance. They initially saw no voting rights for freed blacks, and that was a major mistake. Many of these Union League men now coming south with the idea of Republican Party dominance and freeing blacks, this was your carpetbagger to your post-war Southerner. Not fond of them.
Yeah. And they saw them as carpetbaggers, scallywags, etc.,
yes.
And in league with the black populace that they feared. And so that's a chapter that's really fascinating here, and how the Union Leagues then, of course, folded and became social clubs. I had to go and look. I was surprised that the Chicago Union League didn't have its own fancy building during the war. It wasn't until the 1880s, helping Grant, that they came about, and now not only a social club, they have the largest Midwest private art collection. Wow. The Union League Club right here. Something else I want to ask you, though, akin to this, because it was fairly recently, 1990s maybe late 80s, I don't remember that. I remember the 90s, before Jews were allowed in there. Was that the same in the 1860s? Was it really Protestant, not even Catholic so much? What was the makeup, religious makeup of the Union Leagues?
What I uncovered that it was mostly Protestant in that regard. But in my research, I didn't encounter any overt anti-Catholic or anti-Jewish sentiment one way or the other. The focus was more on the political enemy at hand.
Did they allow membership for Catholics or Jews? As far as you know,
I didn't encounter anything one way
or the
other in that regard.
Well, I'm going to go back to what the core mission of the Union Leagues were: promoting unconditional loyalty to the Union and the Lincoln administration, maybe perhaps by any means. So suspending habeas corpus, closing newspapers, jailing dissidents, intimidation. So then you ask the reader in your book to consider if the political ends justify the political means during an internal civil war in which the nation's very existence may be at stake. Is the country more than the Constitution? You're asking us today to consider that very question. What is your considered opinion on this?
Well, I don't think today we're in a situation where the country
today is exactly that.
Yeah.
But do the ends justify the means? And even when we're not, when maybe we're pre-Civil War, say.
Are you asking me about my opinion for today?
Yeah, or overall. Or even for the future.
Think in the context of the Civil War, when we had a situation where the nation was literally on the verge of being torn apart, the Union League men believed that the ends justified the means, if it meant saving the country. Mm-hmm. In a situation where we're at today, I don't know. I think the Constitution. I believe that we have a Constitution. We're a nation of laws, and if we don't happen to like what the Constitution says, or if there's something not there that we want to be there, well, there's a way to change the Constitution. And in fact, it's been done 20-odd times over the years.
Yeah, well, Lincoln and the administration certainly felt that to save the Union and to save the rest of the Constitution, parts of it maybe had to be put aside for a while during war. So that is taking away from the core value of the Constitution for our country.
Well, for instance, when Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, he likened it to cutting off a limb in order to save a life. But you would never end a life in order to save a limb. So these men, as Francis Lieber said, we must cut and hew through the thicket as best we can. And then as Seward said at the end, were these the right decisions? Well, it's how did it end up? Results.
Results, exactly.
Results.
We're here.
Yes.
We have kind of come to the end of our time, and I've enjoyed this immensely, and you're going to enjoy this book going further into the minutiae of this, and I really feel that you should have this on your shelf. I have it on mine now. Upcoming on Author's Voice, Stranger Than Fiction returns August 14th at 3 p.m. with Nina Barrett, the author of Leopold and Loeb Files. And that's fascinating. And we have some connections here in our shop to Leopold and Loeb, and so you may want to hear about that. And I'm hoping to get a special guest to come in, a psychiatrist who actually knew Nathan Leopold after he got out of prison and spoke with him. So hopefully we'll have that as well. But that's Stranger Than Fiction, Nina Barrett, August 14th at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Then Solved returns with a crime novel with Megan Abbott, author of Give Me Your Hand. That'll be at noon, August 16th. And the same day, A House Divided will come back again on the 16th at 3:30 with James Pula, with his Under the Crescent Moon with the 11th Corps, 1862 to 63. This is Volume 2, From Gettysburg to Victory, 1863 to 65. I hope you'll join us. Excuse me. If you want to ask a question beforehand, you can do that at authorsvoice.net and order a signed copy, of course. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, you can also obtain a signed copy, even though we're after the live presentation. So I hope you will do that. So again, we were here with Paul Taylor, who has the most complete political machine ever known, the North's Union Leagues and the American Civil War. And I think you will enjoy this. I just wanted to say that Jared in Houston, we appreciate your question. Didn't have time for it, but if you go back, you'll see that the question was answered. You asked about Frank Clement and the Copperheads and the validity of the threat to the Union Leagues they were facing. We talked about that before, so go back and look at that. We appreciate your watching and asking questions. Paul, thank you very much. Appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for the staff of Author's Voice and the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. We appreciate everything you do. We couldn't do this without you. Come back again just another week.